Welcome back, guys, to the JPS podcast. We're here with Greg Nuckols, owner of Stronger by Science, which is possibly one of the best online resources for the thinking lifter, where Greg has eloquently bridged the gap between the science and folk in the gym who lift. And he's a very knowledgeable dude with an exercise science degree. He's also extremely familiar with the heavy iron and quite an accomplished powerlifter, and has just released his own research review called Mass with Eric Helms and Mike Zordos, which is a superb resource for training nerds like myself. And
Thanks, dude.
It's safe to say that Greg's, in my opinion, one of the great thinkers in the industry, and I'm honored to have him on the podcast. So welcome, Greg.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Not a problem, man. And today I wanted to discuss, as I'm sure you probably guessed, all things strength. And my first question to you, Greg, is in regards to the rise in popularity of powerlifting. So, is this rise in popularity simply a matter of exposure via social media? And what do you think has contributed the most to this?
I think social media is a lot of it. Not just social media, but like the internet as a whole. So some avenues other than social media is YouTube considered social media? I don't think it is, but a lot of people kind of treat it as such, and like
You just
get to know, like frequently comments on their favorite YouTuber. But yeah, so I don't consider YouTube social media, but powerlifting has gotten really big on YouTube, and it's also gotten really big on Reddit, which I don't fully consider social media. Kind of like the default mode of exercise on like the big fitness subreddit is like powerlifting style training. So I think the internet as a whole, social media and other platforms has contributed a lot to the rise of powerlifting. And I also think that CrossFit has a lot to do with it, both powerlifting and weightlifting. Because I mean, social media existed, and obviously the internet itself existed for quite a while before powerlifting really started taking off. If you look to see when membership numbers in powerlifting and weightlifting federations started really ballooning, it was 2012, 2013, 2014, which is around the time CrossFit started getting really, really big as well. So I think CrossFit has a lot to do with it as well, because I mean, it's done very, very well for itself, and it introduces people to squat, bench, deadlift, snatch, clean and jerk. Mm-hmm. And then, people who decided they liked lifting heavy things more than competitive exercising, they're like, hey, why don't I say that kind of cheek because, like, powerlifting also competitive exercise, but it's competitive kind of easier exercise.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think CrossFit deserves a lot of the credit as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I've never really thought about the influence that CrossFit would have had, but it definitely makes sense. And with the rise in popularity of powerlifting, there's obviously a lot of people that want to get into the sport and improve their squat, bench, dead to get a bigger total, all the rest of it. So what's your advice for a beginner looking to get into powerlifting in terms of getting stronger?
Biggest thing is if you can either find a coach to work with in person. Like I always recommend in-person coaching over online coaching, so don't think this is like me shilling my coaching services. Try to find an in-person coach to work with, and barring that, if there's not a powerlifting coach in your area you can work with, find a crew of lifters to train with. Ideally, people who are already pretty strong and have been in the sport for a while and know what they're doing. But honestly, I think for most people, even if your training partners aren't necessarily that much more experienced and more knowledgeable than you, I think just having training partners is really valuable. Because, even if you don't know much and they don't know much, just having that extra set of eyes is really useful. You'll have someone to chat with, to bounce ideas off of, learn the sport together. Or, again, even better if they've been in the sport for a while and they can kind of show you the ropes. And also, most people, just kind of from what I've observed, tend to actually, no, it's not just what I've observed. Like, there's plenty of research supporting this. Exercising of any sort with other people, that tends to increase your adherence and consistency more than flying solo, both because it increases enjoyment and also because there's someone else who you're at least like informally accountable to. You know, your bro wants you to come lift with him because if nothing else, he needs a spotter and he doesn't have some rando at the gym. So yeah, like those would be my first like big piece of advice. Either find a coach, find a crew to train with, or find a lifting partner. And then past that, first thing, make sure your technique is solid. It's a lot easier to learn good technique on the front end than to learn bad technique and then have to unlearn it and change it. And it's probably just also safer. Like, injuries happen, but if you've been training 3 or 4 years and have an injury, at that point you're already invested in the sport. You've bought into the process. It's gonna suck, but you're probably, you know, you're gonna still be there when the injury gets better. If you've been training 3 months and have an injury, a lot of those people just completely fall off the wagon. So make sure you're learning technique early on so you can lift safely and, you know, be able to put enough time in that you're really invested in the sport before kind of the inevitable first injury strikes.
And with advanced lifters, you wrote a brilliant piece on a different way that we can fix technique with advanced lifters. So obviously skill mastery is one of the big components to building strength, and you spoke about the method of amplification of error. And can you explain to the listeners what this is for a means of improving technique and how we can apply that as advanced lifters?
Yeah, for sure. So basically, trying to think of the order in which to tackle this. Okay, so essentially, method of amplification of error is the idea that for correcting technique, obviously the first step is to become aware that you're making a technique error, and then from there, there's essentially two ways you can go about correcting it. Either you can become aware of the error and then just try to not make the error anymore. Which, like, obviously for your heavy sets, that's what you should be doing. But in terms of like quote unquote technique work, another method you can use to try to correct that technical error is to actually like amplify it. So for example, if your weight shifts too far forward on your foot when you're squatting, you could intentionally squat with the weight really far forward on your foot. Or if the bar tends to drift away in front of you when you deadlift, like set up to deadlift with the bar like 3 inches in front of your shins to begin with. Just stuff like that. And the basic idea behind that is that technique is both a conscious and subconscious process. And for people who already have like a decent mastery of the technique, it's more subconscious. It's your nervous system, your central nervous system, coordinating muscle contraction to like bring about the desired effect. And there may be like 1 or 2 cues you're focusing on, but most of that is just like a subconscious process ordered by your central nervous system. So the idea underpinning the method of amplification of error is essentially if you make, like, you're making this technique error in the first place, because essentially like your nervous system doesn't quite realize, and so I'm personifying your central nervous system. Obviously, like, it's not a human being, but just to make the description easier. Essentially, like, you're not screwing up enough for your nervous system to fully realize how detrimental that mistake is. So by amplifying that mistake, you're giving more feedback to your nervous system about the negative motor consequences of making whatever technique error this is. So like if this is good technique and this is horribly bad technique, and you're typically like here, so decent but not as good as it could be. If you do some practice like here, closer to bad technique, that will better make you like closer to good technique. And also it helps just increase conscious awareness of the technique error as well. So if it's something that you didn't necessarily feel when you were doing this, but maybe your training partner pointed it out to you, or you picked up on it when you were watching video later, it helps you become both more consciously and subconsciously aware of the mistake itself, how it feels, and the motor consequences of it. So then when you go back to focusing on lifting with good technique, you can better compensate and avoid that motor error.
Right, that's awesome. And obviously there's a distinction to be made there that, beginners should practice with near perfect technique over, the course of years. And this is a tool for advanced lifters that have that subconscious, movement pattern that's ingrained. Have you, because it's quite a novel area of study, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's only 2 studies that have been done on this. Have you used it in practice?
Yeah, I've been doing this forever, and I thought it was just kind of like a weird thing that I did. And there's like just now starting to be research on it. But yeah, like warming up to squat, with just like 1 or 2 plates on the bar, I just squat in like really weird ways, and I just kind of, and not necessarily like characteristic ways that I would mess up the lift.
Yeah.
But I don't know, like I'll kind of do like Cossack squats with like 135 on my back, like push all of my weight to one leg, push it to the other leg, squat with the weight way back on my heels, squat with the weight forward on my toes, like intentionally good morning some squats up, let my knees cave in like just a little bit, not to like a dangerous degree, but just, and I have personally found that when I do stuff like that when I'm warming up, then when I get some serious weight on the bar and am actually like trying to squat with good technique, everything just feels crisper. So yeah, it's something I've been doing personally forever, and just kind of thought it was like a weird quirk I had. But apparently it's something.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And something that obviously affects our performance in the gym is stress and lifestyle factors. So can you talk about how stress impacts work capacity and what athletes should be doing to minimize stress outside of training, and your general thoughts around that?
So stress, so psychological stress at least, can definitely negatively influence recovery from training. So a 2014, I believe, study by a researcher named Stoltz-Kalaneman looked at recovery from a relatively difficult lower body workout in, I believe it was untrained lifters, stratified by both perceived and objective measures of stress. So they looked at both like how stressed out the participants felt, and then also if they had like stressful events going on in their lives. So, parent died, a significant other broke up with them. Like those would be kind of like extreme examples of stressful life events. So they compared people who had both high subjective and objective measures of stress to people with low objective and subjective measures of stress, had them do, I believe it was 8 sets of like 10 to 12 reps on the leg press with like 80-ish% 1 rep max, something like that, and look to see like soreness, perceived exertion, and also like force output. So, actual performance recovery. I think it was 2, 24, 48, 72, and 96 hours after training. And the low stress group, after, again, like a pretty hard training session for completely untrained lifters, they were back to baseline in terms of force output 48 hours later.
Right.
Soreness was relatively low. Perceived exertion was, or perceived recovery was pretty high. So yeah, they were still a little sore and didn't feel fully recovered, but force output had fully recovered 48 hours later. Versus the high stress group, it took them 96 hours for force output to get back to baseline. So the recovery period was twice as long, and also they were sore and had lower perceived recovery at every time point measured. So yeah, it can make a pretty meaningful impact in terms of recovery from training. Now, what you can actually do to minimize that, I used to think this was more in your control than I do now. I think so. Just like the athlete's kind of innate psychology impacts that a fair amount. So some people are just naturally more resilient and stress resistant than others. Like to use kind of non-scientific terms, like type B people tend to perceive things as less stressful than like A people do. And that it does seem to be largely an innate psychological characteristic that is somewhat malleable, but not incredibly malleable. And then also like just objectively stressful life events going on, like that's going to be moderated through your psychological makeup, but you can't necessarily you're not necessarily in control of like when you get stressful assignments at work or when a family member dies or something like that. Like you can't control that, and stuff like that is going to cause more stress than just kind of day-to-day stressful things, like maybe having to sit in traffic or something like that. So there is a fair amount of stress that is either entirely or mostly outside of your control. But there is stuff that is within your control that you can do. So one is sleep more. In terms of perceived stress, you perceive things as less stressful when you're well rested. And taking up some form of meditation can help with that as well. So meditation research is something that I'm not into enough to be able to say what like the best form of meditation is for alleviating stress, but most of the research I've read looks at mindfulness meditation. So if you constantly feel stressed, or if there's just a lot of stressful stuff going on in your life and you want to work at decreasing how stressful you find the things going on in your life, I'd recommend looking into mindfulness meditation. Again, it's not going to be like a completely night and day difference, but it definitely can have a beneficial effect.
Awesome. And obviously there's so much individual variation in terms of how this will influence somebody's training. And specifically, when we're looking at peaking for powerlifters, what are some of the big individual differences that you see influencing tapering and peaking for the platform?
The two things that have the biggest impact in my experience is one, just simply how strong someone is, and two, their training volume leading up to the peak. And then also, independent of those two things, sex seems to have an impact on that as well. So in general, weaker people and people who've been training with lower volume leading up to their peak don't need to reduce volume as much for their peak and don't need to taper for as long. And that applies like doubly so for women. Like the female powerlifters I work with tend to be able to train pretty hard up to meet week. And maybe like their taper starts on Sunday or Monday of meet week. And they're completely recovered and ready to go on the platform. Weaker men taper generally if it's starting a week and a half out, they're fine on the platform. Stronger dudes may take up to 2 weeks to taper and then 1 week of deload before training. So the total amount of time required, kind of on the high end, about 3 weeks total. So that would be like generally 1 week of still high intensity but reduced volume, 1 week of slightly lowered intensity and volume, and then 1 deload week of pretty dramatically decreased both in intensity. So that would be kind of like on the one end. So like when I compete, that's what I do.
Yeah.
I'll generally hit my openers and sometimes second attempts 2 weeks out. 1 week out, I'm still lifting 85-ish%, but for pretty low volume.
Mm-hmm.
And then the week of the meet itself, I'm still getting in the gym and training, but we're talking like triples at 60%. So mostly just to keep the patterns fresh, keep everything moving. So that I would assume everyone listening to that podcast, that's kind of like the most extreme taper and peak you would need. Versus someone who, like, maybe it's their first meet, they've only been training for a few months, they're really not all that strong yet. They simply can't induce enough stress in their body that they need a super long time to recover from it. Generally, at that point, hitting your deadlift opener maybe 2 weeks out, because hard deadlifts are always hard to recover from.
Yeah.
So maybe deadlift opener 2 weeks out, squat opener about 10 days out, bench opener about a week out, and then again, after that point, kind of shut down hard training, doubles, triples, 60, 70%, easy stuff rolling into the meet. So
awesome.
Kind of on the two extreme ends of that spectrum. Now, in terms of sex influence,
that was my next question.
There are like legit some women who like don't, like, no matter what you throw at them, they're ready to go again a day later. So a kind of amusing study, and I say amusing because like I'm almost positive the authors like disagreed with their conclusions, but like you have to give the conclusions that the data support. They took people, I believe, with some degree of training experience, so not like high level lifters, but people who'd been training for a few years. And had them do a pretty hard bench workout. I want to say it was like 6 to 8 sets of 8 to 10 reps or something like that. So they maxed before the workout. They did that workout, and then they maxed again 4 hours later, a day later, 2 days later, 3 days later, something like that. There were men and women in it, and the men on average, their 1 rep max had recovered 2 to 3 days later. Mm-hmm. The women, on the other hand,
don't say 4 hours.
4 hours later.
Well,
1 rep max they hit 4 hours after that workout was not significantly different from the pre-workout 1 rep max they hit. So the authors had to write in their conclusions, women should rest at least 4 hours between bench press. And like, good and well, that's not what they actually. But like that's what the data said, and that is really not all that uncommon. That's kind of extreme.
I've definitely seen that in practice.
Women tend to be able to tolerate higher volumes and also recover quite a bit quicker than men can. So just for any given level of competitiveness, women tend to require about half a week shorter taper than men do, kind of on average, from what I've seen.
Awesome. Some really good insight there, and that study's something I'm definitely going to have a read into. And in terms of these, sex differences, obviously estrogen and testosterone are the big players that everyone automatically looks to when comparing men and women. Why are women more tolerant of volume?
Seems to have a lot to do with estrogen. So there have been studies looking at muscle damage and recovery from training in women in different phases of the menstrual cycle. So when estrogen is higher versus when it's lower. And in the phases of the menstrual cycle, when estrogen is lower, they tend to have more muscle damage in response to eccentric exercise and take longer to recover force output after training. And also estrogen itself, just in terms of in vitro work, seems to be a relatively potent anti-inflammatory and also help just protect the muscles from damage. So it seems like a lot of it has to do with estrogen.
Hmm. Awesome. And in terms of athletes and coaches determining what accessory work their competitors need, is it simply a matter of addressing weak points or directed adaptation? Like, what are some things you look to when you're determining what accessories should be used and when?
The first thing I look at is whether accessories are really needed in the
Hmm.
first place. And I don't use nearly as much accessory work with my lifters as I used to.
Mm.
Um, Generally, what I tend to gravitate towards more now is just variations of the core lift.
Hmm.
So, for example, let's say someone has lockout issues in the bench press. I could have them do, direct tricep work or something like that. And that's a couple of years ago. That's what I would tend to lean towards. Now I tend to lean towards more like tricep dominant pressing exercises.
Yeah.
So, maybe like close grip incline, maybe just regular close grip bench, maybe bench with chains to overload the top movement, um, maybe board press. Generally not board press all that much, but that would be another option. Um, so yeah, I tend to lean more towards variations in the core lift
Mm.
now for two reasons. Um, One, actually no, I guess it's just one main reason. It kind of lets right. So it's still working the same general motor pattern that you're interested in, while also addressing that weakness that you want to address.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think that that's generally a better way to go about it. When I do go with just pure accessory work, like kind of isolation, bodybuilding exercises, or things that don't have necessarily like a direct carryover, so maybe like pull-ups, rows, something
Hmm.
like that. It more often than not that tends to just be for people who tend to get banged up if they have too
Yeah.
high of a volume with the core lifts.
Hmm.
Um, so if someone's hips get banged up if they squat too frequently,
Hmm.
if they have weak quads, then maybe I'll have them do like hack squat or leg
Yeah.
press or lunges or step ups or something like that for extra quad work. But kind of my default would be like Paul's tie bar squats or something like
Hmm.
that instead.
Hmm. Awesome. And muscle damage is something that you've spoken about quite a lot, and this was a question I've been wanting to ask you for a while. So, you wrote an article, Grow Like a New Lifter Again, and when I did a podcast with Ian McCarthy a few weeks back on muscle damage, I went back and read all of your work on this, and you mentioned at the top you had a cliff that this article was due for an overhaul. So,
Yep.
is there any particular reason why it's due for an overhaul? Has your opinion and stance on muscle damage and hypertrophy changed?
No, it's mostly because people are idiots and they didn't like properly interpret the article. So um, essentially what I was presenting in the article was less of like a this is how you should train, more of just like a here's an interesting idea
Hmm.
that may be worth a shot. But I guess people don't like fully understand the English language all that well, and they
Hmm.
took it as saying like, oh, this is what Greg recommends. So I need to go back and rewrite it just to make sure that people don't come away with that interpretation. Um, which is one reason I haven't really gotten around to doing it. So like updating an article, like adding more studies, like that,
Hmm.
that's something that's fun and exciting to me. But just like updating an article to save people from themselves
Yeah.
because reading comprehension skills suck.
Yeah.
That's something I don't particularly enjoy doing. Um, like I know as a writer that's partially on me because I need to like read it kind of
Hmm.
through the eyes of a reader and see like how could this be interpreted, like how confident am I that people are going to come away from this with the correct interpretation. So I know it's partially on
Mm.
me. I've also like read it through like quite literally to see why people are coming away with this
Mm.
idea, and whatever, their reading comprehension skills suck. So anyway, um, that's the main thing. So I think mostly, um, Okay, let me just backtrack for people listening to this who haven't read that article. So, in terms of muscle growth, we aren't 100% positive what bottlenecks muscle growth. So why don't you just keep growing forever, right? Because that would be great.
It would be amazing.
But obviously, you build muscle pretty easily for a while, then it becomes a little bit harder, and then it becomes really hard, and then eventually people just stop building muscle. So the question is, like, why does that happen? What is the limiting factor there? And it doesn't seem to be just like basic muscle protein kinetics, so muscle protein synthesis, muscle protein breakdown. We don't have a ton of data on super well-trained people, but from what we've seen so far, muscle protein breakdown really isn't all that exciting. Its rate increases when you're in an unfed state. It decreases when you're in a fed state, and doesn't really vary all that much. So peak muscle protein breakdown is something like a quarter or less, maybe like a tenth, something like that, like a relatively small percentage of peak muscle protein synthesis, and doesn't seem to vary all that much between individuals unless you're like under bed rest or something like that, and muscle protein breakdown increases a lot. So yeah, in terms of muscle protein synthesis, the MPS response to protein feeding seems to be relatively consistent with training. And then in terms of muscle protein synthesis response to a training session, it does, total muscle protein synthesis does decrease as training status increases. But in terms of area under the curve, so total muscle protein synthesis elevation over baseline after a training session, once people have some training experience, it seems like area under the curve is roughly a third to a half of what it is for untrained people, which, like, obviously that's not what you see in the real world when you're looking at actual muscle growth itself. So if you've been training for several years, you're not building muscle at half the rate you were when you were a brand new lifter. You're building muscle quite a bit slower than that. So it could be that when we have more data on really well-trained people, it does turn out that maybe muscle protein synthesis does like really decrease with a lot of training experience. Maybe muscle protein breakdown starts increasing as people become more well-trained. But right now, I don't believe there's evidence of that. So the other thing, which I think is more likely at this point, that could bottleneck muscle growth is the myonuclei of your muscles. So essentially muscle fibers are single cells, but they're kind of unique cells in that they're multinucleated. I think there are only one of two cell types in your body that is multinucleated. I believe one of your larger immune cells is multinucleated as well. But anyways, as opposed to most cells in your body that only have one nucleus, muscle fibers are single cells that have a lot of nuclei in them. And essentially, those nuclei can, for lack of a better term, like oversee and regulate a given volume of sarcoplasm, which is the stuff inside a muscle fiber. So all of your cells have cytoplasm, and sarcoplasm is just the particular name for cytoplasm inside a muscle fiber. And so it seems like each myonucleus, each muscle nucleus, can oversee and regulate a given volume of sarcoplasm. And once there's a limit, like an upper bound on how much sarcoplasm they can oversee and regulate. And once a muscle fiber gets to the size that all of the myonuclei are at what's called their myonuclear domain limit, the fiber just stops growing. So at that point, either muscle growth isn't going to continue occurring, or you need to get more nuclei for that muscle fiber from the surrounding satellite cells. And we see some evidence for like how much myonuclear accretion can matter for muscle growth. So, for example, we see that myonuclear accretion is much faster for newer lifters and more advanced lifters, which may partially explain why they can build muscle quicker. We know that anabolic steroids dramatically increase myonuclear accretion. Obviously, they help with muscle growth as well, beyond like natural limits of muscle growth. So that seems to be an important thing as well. And the concept of muscle memory. So, you've trained before, you've built quite a bit of muscle, then maybe you have to take 6 months out of the gym for whatever reason. You lose a lot of muscle, but if it took you 5 years to build that muscle initially, maybe after 6 months out of the gym, all of that muscle has come back in 2 months or something like that. That's because you still have those myonuclei there. They're what direct protein synthesis, ribosome biogenesis, all of that stuff. And if they're already there and they're overseeing currently small myonuclear domains, they can essentially ramp up all of those processes to get back to myonuclear domain limits pretty quickly, which is why you can rapidly rebuild muscle that's lost with detraining. So yeah, from all of those lines of evidence, we can see that myonuclear accretion is certainly important for hypertrophy. And we also have some evidence that myonuclear accretion increases with muscle damage. So kind of the idea here being that you have these satellite cells, which are just other cells surrounding muscle fibers, but they need to donate their nuclei to the muscle fiber itself. That's what increases myonuclei count in the muscle fiber. And it seems those satellite cells are more predisposed to donating their nucleus to the muscle fiber if the muscle fiber is damaged. Kind of the general idea being that those extra nuclei are kind of called for and required to ramp up the repair response to some sort of damaging stimulus. And so the idea I laid out in this article is that with increased training experience, muscle damage decreases, and to a point, decreased muscle damage is a beneficial thing. So, you're not sore after training, you can train more frequently, you can handle more volume, etc. All good things. But the idea I put forward is that potentially with enough training experience, muscle damage becomes so low that you're not able to adequately add myonuclei to the muscles. And that may be what eventually limits muscle growth. So the idea I put forth is essentially like, if you've hit a hard growth plateau, like nothing you're doing is really like meaningfully adding muscle to your frame anymore, maybe taking 2 or 3 weeks out of the gym, which isn't going to be enough to make you lose a lot of muscle, isn't going to be enough that you like meaningfully lose strength, and what you do lose will come back pretty quickly. But it may resensitize your body to further muscle damage, which may then help you fuse a few more myonuclei, help you grow a little bit more. So the title itself, Grow Like a
The clickbait games.
it was a hyperbolic title.
Oh, that's okay.
So it was more like mechanistically grow like a new lift again, because lifters easily fuse more myonuclei, and so basically like, hey, here may be a potential way to reopen this avenue of muscle growth. But yeah, so I presented it as kind of like speculative. So like, here's the evidence we have. Here is something that may potentially work, but I never like absolutely claimed that it did work or said that everyone should do it. Anyway,
that's how I interpreted it. Anyway,
good, because you're a legit human being.
I appreciate that. So obviously, muscle growth slows down significantly when we advance through our training career, and little tips and tricks like this can help resensitize us to building more muscle. But in terms of strength, obviously strength gains slow down significantly throughout the course of our lifting career. What are some strategies that advanced lifters, when they really start to see their strength plateau, implement to overcome this? What would be like Greg's top 2 tips for improving strength when you hit those nasty plateaus?
honestly, I don't have any. Like, you just have to keep grinding away at it.
Suck
So
it up.
like, I find that people tend to fall in one of three baskets when they start hitting strength plateaus. One group of people, it's not like a true plateau, it's just their strength gains have slowed down dramatically, and they just keep plugging away and keep getting stronger slowly but surely. I've got a client like this right now. He is the most consistent person I've worked with, both in terms of how he executes his training and in terms of his results. So like we started working together probably like 4 years ago. And initially like he made really fast strength gains, but for like the last 2 years, he's been making gains so slowly but so consistently. Like he competes every 3 months, and at every meet, he PRs his bench by 2.5 kilos every other meet. You can and he PRs his squat 2.5 kilos every meet, and he alternates between PRing his deadlift 2.5 kilos and 5 kilos.
Right.
Like it has been perfectly consistent, competing every 3 months for 2 years now. And so like through that process, he's gotten a lot stronger, but he's been getting like kind of on any like short to moderate term time scale, he's been getting stronger very slowly.
Yeah.
But over the past 2 years, like it's added up to a lot.
Exactly.
So, you know, if you're someone who like either tries to PR too frequently or who tries to go for, 5-10 kilo PRs all the time, he's someone who like if you were doing that, it would look like he would be plateaued for like 6 months at a time. If you're trying to PR your bench 5 kilos at a time, he puts 5 kilos on his bench a year consistently.
Yeah.
It would look like his bench was plateaued for a year, but it's still like consistently stronger. So yeah, some people aren't truly plateaued. They're still making, slow but steady, consistent strength progress. But either they're trying to PR too frequently, so they feel like they're at a plateau, or they try to hit too big of PRs, so they can't hit the little PRs that are on the table. So that's one group of people. Another group of people, and this is so frustrating. This is like the group I fall into.
Yeah.
My strength will be completely plateaued, not changing at all for like 2 or 3 years, and then just out of nowhere I'll add 80 pounds to my total. Like I don't know why.
Yeah.
Like nothing meaningful seems to have changed all that much. It does tend to coincide with times that I'm sleeping better, but in terms of like training variables,
Yeah.
Like nothing will happen, and then just poof, I wake up one day and I'm like, I don't know.
That's frustrating.
But I've seen this happen with enough people that I know I'm not alone in this. Like, you just keep grinding away, you keep plugging away, and then just one day you wake up and your body's like, all right, time to get strong again.
Yeah.
And so like no secrets there. It's just a matter of putting in work consistently and just kind of waiting it out.
Patience.
Yeah. And then the last thing is some people, and this is unfortunate, but it seems like some people just kind of get to a point where their body's like, nope, fuck you. You're not going to get any stronger. And yeah.
There's not much you can say about that.
Like I've worked with a few clients like this where, we work together for a year or two. They make pretty consistent progress. They start hitting a plateau. We just kind of plug away for a while. Nothing really happens. We make some adjustments. Nothing really happens. We make more adjustments. Nothing really happens. They make big adjustments on their end with diet or sleep or stress management or something. Nothing really happens. And then at that point, it's just kind of like how you interpret that, like what you do with it. Are you just like, okay, I'm fine with being this strength and I still enjoy training and I'm going to stick with it? Or is it kind of like, I'm sort of strong at this point, but I'm never going to be a world champion, so what is the point? I find that not many people kind of fall into that second category, but some do. And yeah, like sometimes I think there for everyone there is just kind of a level of strength that your body that kind of like circumscribes like the top end of how strong you can get.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's kind of a matter of how you get there. So some people it's slow and steady and they get there at some point. Some people gain strength pretty quickly and consistently up to that point, hit it, that's it. And then and some people it's just kind of like start and stop, super nonlinear, and eventually their craps out on them. So
awesome.
I don't really think there's that much of a secret though. Just keep plugging away at it, and if you are like truly at a plateau and you've been plugging away at it for a while, change your training. I don't think there's like one surefire way that's going to break you out of it. Maybe it's more volume, maybe it's more intensity, maybe it's a larger variety of exercises, but just change something. Definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. So change something. Yeah,
brilliant points. I tend to see now a lot more relevance to those three groups that you said people fit into, and I can already start to see where my clients are fitting within that. And something I wanted to ask you about before we wrap up this podcast, Greg, was in terms of platform performance and the psychology and arousal, surrounding going for a 1 rep max. Do you have much familiarity with the science behind arousal and how this affects performance and how we can maximize that when we're testing strength?
I mean, in terms of like primary literature, no. Something that interests me, but something I've not put a lot of time into learning. I mean, most of what I know about it is just from classes in college, where it seems like there's kind of like a curve where at the peak of the curve is optimal arousal, optimal performance. On the left side of the curve is insufficient arousal, so you probably just don't put enough effort into it to get optimal performance. And on the right side of the curve is excessive arousal, where like basically you psych yourself out or you're just kind of so crazy that you can't
focus.
Like technique goes out the window or something like that. So actually, after I learned that in undergrad, I was like, oh, this is interesting. Let me look for research on it. Sports psychology research is not all that good. Right. And in terms of when I found some review papers discussing this phenomenon, and I looked up some of the papers they were citing, a lot of them were in rodent models, and a lot of them were on relatively simple tasks that may not have all that much relevance to sports performance. So like fine motor skills, just with your hand or something like that. So who knows? Maybe it's relevant to professional gamers. Which, in my experience, I do think that it has some validity. Obviously, if you're insufficiently aroused, if you're not in it to win it with a 1 rep max deadlift, you're gonna fail. You can't be too chill for a 1 rep max deadlift. So I feel like that's almost self-evidently true. In terms of excessive arousal, I've definitely seen some people psych themselves out and technique go out the window. But I kind of think for some people, it's less of that, bell curve and more of just a straight line where I have this one friend, Josh, who I'm honestly afraid for him every time he goes for a 1 rep max on any lift. He gets these eyes that he looks like a feral animal. He is I think the only possible way he could become more aroused at that point is just injecting a near lethal dose of crystal. But that's what it takes. And the crazier he gets, the better he lifts.
Yeah.
So left side of the curve, insufficient arousal, decreased performance. Absolutely. I feel like that's almost self-evidently true. Then in terms of arousal on the high end, I think it is kind of that bell curve for some people where, they need to be up and be aroused, but they psych themselves out or technique goes out the window if they get too aroused. Some people I think it's just kind of more is better. And I think it's just kind of a different psychological style for those two groups of people.
Awesome. And one of my final questions for you is, when are you going to write the ultimate guide to reverse grip bench press?
There's really not much to say, man. Okay, reverse grip bench press.
Shed some light on this.
Here's what you need to know. So the only way it works is by shortening range of motion as much as possible. You can touch a reverse grip bench press probably like 4 inches lower on like your chest / stomach than a regular bench press. And that's what, so my reverse grip bench press is about 35 pounds above my regular bench press when I'm fat. Like when I lose weight, it's like 30 pounds below my weight. So like I reverse grip benched 485, and that was I knew it was the day to do it because like I just eaten sushi, and I really like soy sauce.
Yeah.
And so like that has a lot of sodium, makes you hold on to water. Plenty of carbohydrate in the sushi, makes you hold on to water, and the soy sauce makes you thirsty. So I was drinking a ton. So like I actually wasn't that big. I was doing a meet at 242, and I was like 244 or something like that at the time. So it was pretty close to the meet. So I don't like big water cuts. So I really wasn't like that big relative to where I've been before, but I was incredibly bloated.
Yeah.
Like just like the kind of bloat where like you smile and you can tell your cheeks are like closed up.
Yeah.
So I was like, all right, it's time for some reverse grip benching. And so yeah, like it was purely the bloat. Like I took plenty of time to warm up so I could get a big arch. I could stick my stomach way out because I was super bloated, and it was glorious. It was the best bench I've ever had.
Did everyone lose their minds when they saw you go out and reverse grip bench press?
Some people were like, "Is that legal?" And I was like, "Yes." Like, check the rule book first. But yeah, so it works via reducing range of motion. So
touch point is critical.
If you don't have a really big arch, you're probably not going to really get anything out of it. In terms of maximizing it, you need strong biceps. And if you don't, you're probably going to get biceps tendonitis from it, because it's like if you haven't done it before, you'll probably get like a pretty sick bicep pump from it, because it is like a super heavy isometric for your biceps. Yeah. And you need to make sure you arch a lot. Take the maximum legal width grip, and instead of gripping it with your hands, like this, like straight out, you rotate your hands out like that so the bar sits kind of diagonally across your palm. Make sure the bar is sitting low enough in your hand that it's not going over this bone. If the bar is sitting right on this bone, you're going to hate life. Yeah. And if it's too high in your hands, you have to cock your wrist back a ton to reverse grip bench properly and not drop the bar on yourself. So since you're cocking your wrist back so much, if it's sitting too high in your hands, it's going to cause a lot of wrist pain. Yeah. So it needs to be sitting low in your hands, diagonally across, so it goes from here just in between these two bones. Yeah. So yeah, get tight, set the biggest arch possible, inflate your stomach as much as you're capable, take that maximum legal width grip, touch as low as you can, pop it right back up. Like if you do it right, it'll feel like a 2-board press.
I am so excited to give it a try. And
you don't look fat enough, man. If you're not,
I can get a bit of an arch, so we'll see how we go.
I'm in the process of trying to cut to 220 right now, and I'm like, I know at this point my reverse grip bench is probably 20 pounds lower than my regular bench. Like it is very much like an arch and fat dependent strategy. Like it's not something most people are going to get very much out of.
I'm going to eat a lot of sushi, drink a lot of water, and I'll check back in with you and let you know how I go.
All right, man. Best of luck.
And the last question I have is, you want silly looking traps, right?
Yeah.
So, I would dare say that most of the male population are in with you on this one. They want those big Hulk-like traps. So, how do you plan on achieving this outside of rack pulls? Or are rack pulls the only exercise that you're going to use to build those silly looking traps?
I seem to get a lot out of snatch grip high pulls as well. Yeah, that's about it.
That's it.
I think a lot of people waste their time doing too many shrugs. There's actually some work showing, and this surprised me when I came across it. There's some work showing that your traps actually aren't your primary scapular elevator. That's your levator scapula. So yeah, shrugs. I never got much out of shrugs, and I thought maybe I was just doing them wrong. Then I came across that, and I was like, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense. So I tend to find, just for me personally, my traps don't seem to respond unless I kind of attack them relatively violently. So, super heavy block pulls, like that's just pulling down on them enough that something has to happen. It's kind of like a forced eccentric / heavy isometric / weighted stretch. And then snatch grip high pulls, it's, kind of a violent movement. And also like when the weight like hits you really hard at the bottom, that feels like it gives my traps like a really big stretch when it hits before I reset for the next rep.
Awesome. So all those bros out there shrugging away, take note. There's a better way.
I don't know. I don't have particularly huge traps yet. Here's kind of the irony. So like I do care about the research a lot. I read a lot of research, and I do know that soreness is not a valid indicator that something is effective exercise. But also there aren't good studies on trap training. Yeah. That's not for some completely strange reason. That's not what gets a lot of research funding. Like
I wonder why.
So I think you can take a super research-based approach to trap training. Yeah. So really, the only thing
you got his anecdote.
I have used for my guide is like what makes my trap super sore.
Yeah.
Which I know is a bad indicator, but at least it is an indicator.
It's something, correct.
And so, yeah, above the knee rack pulls and snatch grip high pulls just wreck my traps. So, yeah, screw it. I'm going with them for a while.
Awesome to hear, man. Greg, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you being on the podcast. Guys, we hope you enjoyed that podcast, learned a lot from Greg. If you did, make sure you like this video, subscribe to our channel, and we'll speak to you all next time. Thanks for listening, guys. Bye.
Thanks for having me.
Greg.